All right, so picture this. Late summer 1892, South Dakota. The wheat fields stretch out forever, golden and heavy, ready for harvest. And there's this problem, see? A problem that's been plaguing farmers for decades. Steam engines. Big, heavy, dangerous steam engines that power the threshing machines. They work, sure, but they're temperamental. They need constant water. They're slow to move between fields. And worst of all, they have this nasty habit of starting fires. John Frolic knew this better than most. He was a grain elevator operator and custom thresher from Frenchtown, Iowa. Not some wealthy industrialist, not a trained engineer, just a guy who understood farming, understood machinery, and understood that there had to be a better way. Every harvest season, he'd take his threshing crew up to South Dakota, following the wheat harvest north. And every season, he'd watch these massive steam engines lumber from field to field, belching smoke, drinking water, threatening to burn down the very crops they were supposed to be harvesting. The thing is, by 1892, gasoline engines existed. Small ones, anyway. Mostly stationary engines for running equipment in shops and factories. But nobody, and I mean nobody, had successfully mounted one on a traction engine frame and made it actually work in the field. The internal combustion engine was still this newfangled technology that most people didn't trust. It was unpredictable, hard to start, prone to breaking down. Steam was proven. Steam was reliable. Well, sort of. But Frolic, he'd been thinking. He'd been watching. He'd seen the Van Dusen single-cylinder gasoline engine, made by the Van Dusen Gas and Gasoline Engine Company in Cincinnati. It was a vertical, single-cylinder affair, maybe 16 horsepower on a good day. And he thought, what if? What if someone took that engine, mounted it on a Robinson chassis, a traction engine frame that was already proven for moving heavy equipment, and made it drive the wheels? What if you could have power without the steam, without the water wagon, without the constant fear of fire? So he did it. In the winter of 1891 into 92, back in his shop in Frenchtown, Frolic built something that had never existed before. He took that Van Dusen engine, bolted it to a modified Robinson traction chassis, and engineered a system that would let the gasoline engine not only provide power, but actually propel the machine forward and backward. That last part's important, forward and backward, because a traction engine that can only go forward is pretty much useless when you need to reposition around obstacles or back up to a threshing machine. He worked through the winter, solving problem after problem. How do you transfer power from a vertical engine to horizontal drive wheels? How do you create a transmission system that allows for both forward and reverse? How do you keep the whole thing from shaking itself apart? Remember, gasoline engines ran at much higher speeds than steam engines. They vibrated differently. They produced power in sharp, violent bursts with each explosion in the cylinder, not the smooth, continuous push of steam pressure. By the time spring rolled around in 1892, Frolic had his machine. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't refined, but it was ready to prove itself. And that meant heading north to South Dakota, to the wheat fields near Langford, where the real test would happen. Because building something in your shop is one thing, making it work day after day in dust and heat, pulling heavy loads, that's something else entirely. The crew that followed Frolic north that summer had no idea they were about to witness history. They just knew John had built some kind of gasoline-powered contraption, and they were curious, and probably a little skeptical, whether it would last more than a day. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Frolic's invention, but the entire future of mechanized agriculture. And spoiler alert, it almost didn't work out. In fact, the success of that first harvest would be very nearly destroyed by the spectacular failure that came immediately after. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about what happened when that machine fired up for the first time in an actual wheat field, and why the farmers who witnessed it couldn't quite believe what they were seeing.
So here's what made that first run so remarkable, and why, technically speaking, it should have been impossible. When Froelich fired up that Van Dusen engine in the wheat fields of South Dakota, he wasn't just starting a motor. He was attempting something no one had successfully done before. Get a gasoline engine, which was designed to run at a constant speed in one place to provide smooth, controllable power for moving a multi-ton machine across uneven ground, while also driving a belt pulley for operating threshing equipment. The Van Dusen engine he used was a single-cylinder 4-stroke design, one big piston going up and down in a vertical cylinder. Every other stroke was a power stroke, which meant the engine delivered power in sharp pulses. Now, with steam engines, you had continuous, smooth pressure. With this gasoline engine, every time that piston hit its power stroke, the whole machine wanted to lurch forward. Imagine trying to drive a car where the engine only fires once every 2 seconds, and every time it fires, you get a sharp kick. That's what Froelich was dealing with. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity, even if it wasn't particularly elegant. He used a massive flywheel, probably weighing hundreds of pounds, to smooth out those power pulses. The flywheel would absorb energy during the power stroke and release it gradually, keeping the machine moving at a steadier pace. But even with that, the vibration must have been incredible. We're talking about a machine that had no engine mounts, no rubber isolation, no sophisticated suspension, just steel bolted to steel, with every explosion in that cylinder resonating through the entire frame. Then there was the transmission system, and this is where Froelich really showed his genius, because he couldn't just copy what steam engines did. He needed to create a way to engage and disengage power to the wheels, and to provide both forward and reverse motion. What he came up with was a friction clutch system and a simple but effective gear arrangement that used chains and sprockets. By moving levers, the operator could slide gears into different positions, changing the direction of power flow to the wheels. It was primitive, sure, but it worked. The drive system used chains running from the transmission to the rear wheels. Big, heavy chains, like what you'd see on early bicycles, but scaled up massively. The wheels themselves were steel, with cleated spikes to dig into the soil for traction. No rubber, no pneumatics, just steel on dirt with all the weight of the machine pressing down to keep those wheels from spinning out. Cooling was another challenge. That Van Dusen engine used what's called an open cooling system with a water jacket around the cylinder. Water would circulate around the hot cylinder, absorbing heat, then flow through a simple primitive radiator, a series of metal tubes where air passing over them would cool the water back down. But here's the thing. When you're moving slowly through a wheat field on a hot August day, you're not getting much airflow. That engine ran hot, really hot. Froelich had to stop regularly to let it cool down and to refill the water tank. Fuel was gravity-fed from a tank mounted above the engine. Simple, no fuel pump, just let gravity do the work. The carburetor, if you can even call it that, was a basic mixing chamber where air and gasoline vapor would combine before being sucked into the cylinder. Starting the engine required manually turning the flywheel to get the piston moving, then hoping the ignition would catch. And the ignition? That was a hot tube system, where a metal tube would be heated by a small burner until it glowed red hot, and when the fuel mixture hit that hot tube, it would ignite. Primitive, unreliable, and absolutely terrifying when it worked. But work it did. For 52 days that harvest season, Froelich's machine threshed grain. 72,500 bushels of wheat. It moved from field to field under its own power, no horses needed. It operated the threshing machine reliably day after day, and most importantly, it didn't start any fires, not one. The farmers who watched it work were stunned. Here was a machine that could do everything a steam engine could do, but without the constant need for water, without the long warm-up times, without the bulk and danger of a boiler. It could be fired up in minutes, not hours. It could run all day on a tank of gasoline that you could refill from a barrel, instead of requiring a water wagon to follow it constantly. It was smaller, lighter, more maneuverable. Froelich knew he had something big. This wasn't just a successful experiment. This was the future of farming. And so, in the spring of 1893, he went looking for investors to help him build more machines and start a company. And that's where everything started to go wrong. because building one machine that works in your shop and proving it in the field with your own crew is one thing. Building them in quantity, selling them to skeptical farmers, and keeping a business afloat, that's something else entirely. And as Froelich is about to learn, success in the field doesn't automatically translate to success in the marketplace.
John Frolic returned from that South Dakota harvest with proof. 72,000 bushels of wheat threshed, 52 days of operation, 0 fires. His gasoline traction engine had performed flawlessly, at least in his hands, with his crew, under his supervision. Now he just needed to convince the world. In the spring of 1893, Frolic gathered a group of investors from Waterloo, Iowa. There was William Mann, a local banker and businessman. There were the Whitwer brothers, prominent Waterloo residents. There was John Levitt, who ran a foundry. Together, they formed the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company. The plan was simple: build and sell gasoline-powered traction engines to farmers who were sick of dealing with steam. Get in early, dominate the market, and become rich as mechanized farming took over America. They set up shop in Waterloo, in a modest building that served as both factory and office. They hired a small crew of mechanics and machinists. They ordered parts from suppliers, and they set about building their first production machines. These weren't going to be hand-built one-offs like Frolic's original. These were going to be manufactured, standardized, reliable machines that any farmer could operate. And that's where the problems started. The first machines they built were based on Frolic's design, but with modifications. The investors wanted to make them cheaper to build. They wanted to use more readily available parts. They wanted to streamline production. All reasonable business decisions. But here's what they didn't account for. Frolic had spent months perfecting every detail of his original machine. Every gear ratio, every chain tension, every clearance and tolerance had been figured out through trial and error. When you start changing things, even small things, in a machine that's barely proven, you run into problems. The first batch of production machines didn't work as well as the original. They were harder to start. They overheated more easily. The chain drives wore out faster. The transmissions had a tendency to jam or slip out of gear. And when these machines were sold to actual farmers who didn't have Frolic's intimate knowledge of how to baby them along and fix problems on the fly, they failed. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but consistently. Enough that farmers started demanding refunds. Enough that word spread. And here's the thing about farming communities in the 1890s. Word spread fast. If a machine didn't work, everybody knew about it within weeks. And farmers talked to each other. They shared information. They warned each other. And pretty soon, the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company had a reputation problem. But the bigger issue was this: the market wasn't ready. See, Frolic and his investors had assumed that because the machine worked, farmers would want to buy it. But steam traction engines, for all their faults, were a known quantity. There were established manufacturers. There were dealers who could provide parts and service. There were mechanics who knew how to fix them. Gasoline engines, on the other hand, were new. They were unfamiliar. And most critically, they were unproven in the eyes of the average farmer. You have to remember, this was 1893, 1894. The internal combustion engine was still exotic technology. Most farmers had never even seen a gasoline engine, let alone operated one. The idea of trusting your entire harvest to a machine powered by explosive vapors instead of good old reliable steam seemed insane to a lot of people. And when those early production machines from Waterloo started having problems, it confirmed everyone's worst fears. On top of that, there was competition. Not from gasoline traction manufacturers, there weren't any yet, but from steam engine companies who saw gasoline as a threat and worked hard to convince farmers to stick with what they knew. Companies like Case, Altman Taylor, and Buffalo Pitts had decades of experience, established dealer networks, and reputations built on thousands of machines in the field. They weren't about to let some upstart operation in Iowa steal their business without a fight. By 1895, the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company was in trouble. They'd sold maybe 4 machines total. They were burning through their capital. The investors were getting nervous, and the harsh reality was setting in. Just because you built the first gasoline tractor doesn't mean you can build a successful business around it. The company pivoted. They shifted focus to building stationary gasoline engines for farm and industrial use, engines that didn't have to move, that didn't have the complexity of a traction drive system.
These engines were simpler, more reliable, and there was actually a market for them. Mills needed power, grain elevators needed power, workshops needed power, and a small gasoline engine that you could set up anywhere without needing a water supply or firing up a boiler, that had real appeal. So the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, they dropped traction from the name, started building stationary engines, and they were successful at it. They became one of the leading manufacturers of farm engines in the Midwest. They built the business slowly, carefully, focusing on reliability and customer service. But the gasoline tractor, that died. Or at least it appeared to. The machines they'd built were sold off or scrapped. Froelic's original 1892 machine, nobody knows what happened to it. It probably ended up in a scrapyard or rusted away in some farmer's field. The dream of replacing steam with gasoline seemed to have failed, and John Frolic himself, he left the company. Frustrated, disillusioned, he moved on to other ventures. He didn't get rich. He didn't become famous. For years, his contribution was almost completely forgotten. But the story doesn't end there, because the idea that a gasoline engine could power a farm tractor, that idea didn't die. It just waited for technology to catch up, waited for someone else to pick up where Frolic left off. And when that finally happened, it would vindicate everything Frolic had tried to do. But it would take another 10 years, and it would take a company that learned from Waterloo's mistakes.
So let's talk about why Frolic's gasoline tractor almost disappeared into history, and what had to change before the idea could actually succeed. Because this isn't just a story about one machine or one company. It's about timing, technology, and the brutal reality of trying to introduce something revolutionary when the world isn't quite ready for it. First, there was the technology problem. Frolic's machine worked, but just barely. The engines of the 1890s were, to put it bluntly, terrible. They were unreliable. They were hard to start. They lacked power for their weight. The metallurgy wasn't there yet to build strong, lightweight components that could handle the stresses of continuous operation. Bearings wore out fast, gaskets leaked, ignition systems failed, and there was no infrastructure to support them. No trained mechanics, no spare parts network, no body of common knowledge about how to maintain and repair gasoline engines. Compare that to steam engines. By the 1890s, steam technology had been refined for over a century. Every blacksmith, every millwright, every competent farm mechanic understood how steam engines worked. You could fix them with basic tools and readily available parts. The technology was mature, proven, understood. Gasoline engines, they were the opposite. Cutting edge, unpredictable, and when they broke, good luck figuring out why. Then there was the competition. The steam engine manufacturers weren't stupid. They saw gasoline engines coming and they fought back hard. Not with better technology, at least not at first, but with marketing, with dealer support, with price cuts. Case and the other big steam manufacturers could afford to drop their prices to defend market share. They had the scale, the established customer base, the financial reserves. The Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company didn't. They were trying to bootstrap a new technology with limited capital, and every machine that came back as a return or needed warranty work ate into their tiny operating budget. And then there was the agricultural economy itself. The 1990s were rough for American farmers. Crop prices were falling, foreign competition was increasing. The Panic of 1893 triggered a severe economic depression that lasted years. Banks failed, credit dried up. Farmers who might have been willing to take a chance on a new gasoline tractor in better times couldn't afford to gamble when money was tight. They stuck with what they knew, or they went back to horses because horses didn't require any cash outlay. So Frolic's timing was terrible. He had the right idea, but he was at least a decade too early. The technology wasn't mature enough, the market wasn't ready, the economic conditions were wrong, and his company didn't have the resources to weather the storm and wait for things to improve. But here's where it gets interesting, because while the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Company abandoned tractors and focused on stationary engines, they kept learning. They kept improving their gasoline engine designs. They built better carburetors, better ignition systems, better cooling systems. They figured out how to make engines more reliable, more powerful, easier to start. And all of that knowledge, all of that experience, it was still there, waiting. Meanwhile, the agricultural world was changing.
Farms were getting larger, crop prices were recovering, the technology was improving across the board. By the early 1900s, several other companies were experimenting with gasoline tractors. Companies like Hart Parr, which was formed in 1901 and actually coined the word tractor to describe their machines. Companies like International Harvester, which saw the potential and started pouring resources into development. The market was finally ready. And the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company? They stayed in business. They kept building stationary engines. They kept learning, kept improving. And in 1914, more than 20 years after Froelic's first gasoline tractor, they got back into the tractor business. They introduced the Waterloo Boy, a simple, reliable, relatively affordable gasoline tractor that actually sold. It wasn't as advanced as some of the competition's models, but it was honest, dependable, and backed by a company that had learned hard lessons about building engines that actually worked in the real world. The Waterloo Boy was successful enough that it caught the attention of a much larger company, one that was looking to get into the tractor business but didn't want to start from scratch. And in 1918, that company bought the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company for $2,100,000. The buyer? John Deere. Better known as John Deere, the Waterloo Boy became John Deere's entry into the tractor market, and from that foundation, John Deere would eventually become the largest tractor manufacturer in the world. But none of that happens without Froelic's 1892 machine. None of that happens without the hard lessons learned by the Waterloo Company in the 1890s when they tried to sell gasoline tractors and failed. So here's the thing about innovation, and this is important. The first person to invent something rarely gets rich from it. The first company to market a new technology rarely dominates the industry. What matters is who perfects it, who makes it practical, who makes it affordable, who's there when the market is actually ready. Frolic invented the gasoline tractor, but he didn't get to see it succeed. The Waterloo Company built the bridge between that first experimental machine and the tractors that actually changed farming. And John Deere, they took that foundation and built an empire on it. But without Froelic's gamble in 1892, without his willingness to try something everyone said was impossible, without that first successful harvest in South Dakota, maybe none of the rest happens. Or maybe it happens differently, slower, with more false starts. We'll never know. What we do know is that the line from Froelic's machine to the modern farm tractor is direct and clear. Every tractor you see today, every piece of mechanized farm equipment powered by an internal combustion engine, they're all descendants of that crude, noisy, temperamental machine that John Frolic built in his shop in Iowa and proved in the wheat fields of South Dakota in 1892.
So what's the real lesson here? Because this isn't just a story about one guy who built a tractor. It's a story about how innovation actually works, and it's a lot messier than we usually like to admit. John Frolic saw a problem. Farmers needed power in the field, but steam engines were dangerous, inefficient, and impractical. He saw a solution. The gasoline engine, which was still new and unproven, could theoretically do everything steam could do, but better. And he had the knowledge and the skill to actually build a working prototype. That's rare. Most people can see problems. Some can imagine solutions. Very few can actually build the solution and prove it works. But proving it works and making it commercially successful are two completely different challenges. Frolic proved his machine worked. He ran it for an entire harvest season, threshed 72,000 bushels of wheat, and demonstrated that gasoline power was viable for farm work. That was the engineering challenge, and he solved it. What he couldn't solve was the business challenge, the market challenge, the economic challenge. And that wasn't really his fault. The world just wasn't ready yet. Think about what had to happen before gasoline tractors could succeed. Engine technology had to improve. Metallurgy had to advance so you could build stronger, more reliable components. Manufacturing processes had to develop to make it possible to produce engines in quantity at affordable prices. A supply chain had to emerge for parts and service. Mechanics had to be trained. Farmers had to become familiar with gasoline engines through other applications, like stationary farm engines, so they'd trust the technology enough to bet their harvest on it. The agricultural economy had to stabilize, so farmers had the money to invest in new machinery. And honestly, some of the old guard had to retire or go out of business, so there was room in the market for something new. All of that took time, 20 years as it turned out, and during those 20 years, Froelic's contribution was almost completely forgotten. The history books of the early 1900s didn't mention him. When Hart Parr started calling their machines tractors and claiming to be the pioneers of gasoline-powered farm equipment, nobody corrected them. Frolic had moved on, and the Waterloo Company had pivoted to stationary engines, so who was going to argue? It wasn't until much later, when historians started digging into the origins of the tractor industry, that Froelic's 1892 machine was rediscovered and recognized for what it was: the first, the proof of concept, the machine that showed it could be done. And by then, Frolic himself was long dead. He died in 1933 at the age of 76. He lived long enough to see gasoline tractors completely replace steam and dominate American farming. He lived long enough to see John Deere become a giant of the industry, building millions of tractors based on the foundation of the Waterloo Boy. But he never got wealthy from his invention. He never got famous. He got a footnote, eventually, once people went back and checked the records. And maybe there's something appropriate about that, because innovation isn't usually about the glory. It's about solving problems. Frolic didn't build his tractor to get famous. He built it because he was tired of dealing with steam engines, and he thought there was a better way. He proved there was. That was enough. Today, if you visit Frolic, Iowa, a tiny town that was renamed in his honor, there's a monument. A replica of his tractor sits in a park, a reminder of what he accomplished. And at the Smithsonian Institution, in their collections of agricultural history, there's recognition of Frolic's contribution as the inventor of the gasoline traction engine. Not the man who made it profitable, not the man who perfected it, but the man who proved it could work. And that matters, because every modern farm tractor, whether it's a John Deere, a Case, a New Holland, a Kubota, they all trace their lineage back to that moment in 1892, when John Frolic fired up a gasoline engine in a wheat field and drove it under its own power. Every advance in tractor technology since then, from diesel engines to hydraulics to GPS-guided automation, builds on that foundation. Frolic didn't just build a tractor, he opened a door. And once that door was open, there was no closing it. The steam engine manufacturers fought against gasoline for years, but they lost. By the 1920s, steam traction engines were obsolete. By the 1930s, they were museum pieces. The future Frolic saw in 1892 had arrived, and it was irreversible. Today, there are millions of tractors working in fields around the world. They feed billions of people. They've made agriculture efficient enough that a tiny fraction of the population can produce enough food for everyone else. And it all started with one guy in Iowa who thought steam engines were stupid and decided to do something about it. So the next time you see a tractor, any tractor, remember John Frolic. Remember that someone had to be first. Someone had to take the risk, build the prototype, prove the concept, and endure the failure that came after. Because that's how progress actually happens. Not through sudden breakthroughs and instant success, but through stubborn individuals who solve problems one at a time, even when the world isn't quite ready for their solutions. Frolic's gasoline tractor almost failed. The company almost went bankrupt. The technology almost got abandoned, but it didn't, and that made all the difference. If you've made it this far, you're probably someone who appreciates stories about innovation, about engineering, about the machines and the people who built the modern world. There are so many of these stories that never get told, inventions that changed everything but the inventors died broke and forgotten, companies that pioneered entire industries but got crushed by competitors who came later with more money and better timing, machines that revolutionized the way we live but nobody remembers who designed them or why. These stories matter. They remind us that progress is hard, that being first doesn't guarantee success, that innovation requires not just brilliance, but persistence, timing, luck, and the willingness to fail publicly and keep going anyway. The world we live in now, with all its technology and machinery and convenience, wasn't inevitable. It was built by people like John Frolic, one stubborn decision at a time. It's pretty wild when you think about it. Back in Froelic's time, communication was slow, travel was difficult, and if you wanted to build something, you pretty much had to figure it out yourself with whatever resources you had locally. Today, we're connected across the entire world. You're reading this from somewhere. Maybe Iowa, maybe India, maybe Brazil. Doesn't matter. The fact that we can share these stories, that someone in Tokyo can learn about a farmer in Iowa who built a tractor in 1892, that's kind of a miracle. So where are you reading from? Drop a comment. I genuinely love to know. Thank you for sticking with this story. Thank you for caring about history, about machines, about the people who built things before anyone knew if they'd work. If you have thoughts, experiences with old tractors, or knowledge about early farm machinery, leave a comment. I read every single one. I love hearing from people who actually worked on these machines, or whose grandparents did, or just find this stuff as fascinating as I do. One quick note, since we're talking about something from 1892, authentic photographs are pretty rare. For some parts of this story, I've used real, period-appropriate images that illustrate the era, the machines, and the places we've discussed. Never AI-generated, and I make sure never to repeat an image in a video. All sources are listed in the description, so if you think any fact isn't quite right, you can check them yourself. I want these stories to be as accurate as possible. I genuinely love making these videos. I love digging into the history, finding the human stories behind the machines, and sharing them with people who actually care. Your support means everything, and I'm trying to get better with every video. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. There are a lot more stories like this one, stories about the machines and the people who changed the world, quietly, without much recognition, but who made everything we have today possible. Thanks again for watching. Until next time.